It was another day of just about nothing for the Orioles at the winter meetings on Tuesday. Kind of slow down there in Nashville so far. But the Orioles still have plenty of players currently on the roster that we can talk about. And today it's going to be Danny Coulombe and Cionel Pérez reviewing the seasons for those two lefties coming up on this episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast.
You are Locked On Orioles, your daily Baltimore Orioles podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hey there, Orioles fans. Today is Wednesday, December 6th, 2023, and welcome back into the Locked On Orioles podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. As always, I'm your host, Connor Newcomb. And coming up on today's episode, we are going to continue our Orioles 2023 season player review series as we will look at two of the Orioles' most important lefties in the bullpen, Danny Coulombe and Cionel Pérez. And we will take a gander at each of their seasons. Danny Coulombe, who came over in what looked like a very minor trade the day before opening day, ended up being the Orioles' most reliable lefty. And then Cionel Pérez coming off an amazing 2022. Terrible first half. Some, including me at times, calling for that experiment to be over. And then he turned it on and was a huge part of the O's bullpen down the stretch of the season. And joining us to talk about those two guys will be Jacob Calvin Meyer. He covers the Orioles for the Baltimore Sun. He has been on this podcast before, and he'll help me break down Coulombe's season, Perez's season, and what their roles will be for the Orioles in 2024. All right, so we welcome Jacob Calvin Meyer back into the podcast. He covers the Orioles over at the Baltimore Sun. He is here to talk about two Orioles left-handed relievers. And Jacob, first of all, welcome back to the podcast.
Thanks for having me on, man.
So we're going to talk about Danny Coulombe and Cionel Pérez today, two lefties who, by the end of the year, were pretty huge parts of the Orioles bullpen. Each of them pitched in two of the three postseason games. Each of them were big down the stretch in September. And I wanted to start with Danny Coulombe because he was one of the better stories for the Orioles. And if it weren't for Yennier Cano this year, Jacob, I think the story would have been Danny Coulombe about how they just kind of took this guy and reimagined his pitch mix and got him for cash considerations the day before opening day and turned him into a reliever who threw 61 times and had a 2.81 ERA. So when you look back on the first full season in an Orioles uniform for Danny Coulombe, like what will you kind of think back to? What do you remember? What sticks out from that first season with the O's for the veteran left-hander?
Yeah, I think, listen, you have to give the organization and the front office its flowers with this one. This is they've made under the radar types of moves like these, especially with guys in the bullpen, and found some success with them. But to go out and get a guy who, Coulombe in his career before coming to Baltimore had some flashes of success, but he was, in his early 30s, was still, a couple years away from arbitration and had never really put together a full, healthy, good season, great season. He had dealt with some health issues. He had hip surgery last season. And so, I talked to him a little bit during the season for a story about that hip surgery and the difficulty of that injury. That's, it's one when you do have, as a pitcher, and you have a hip injury and you get surgery, it can be something that really kind of messes with your delivery and can hamper you. But he is pretty fortunate, he thinks, to have had a really clean procedure, and then he had a full off season. And then it was such an under the radar move that nobody really thought too much of it. And in fact, when they traded for him, some people thought perhaps they would try to, pass, then send him down and then pass him through, try to get him through waivers in some way. But it became pretty clear early on that this was a guy that they viewed that could be an important part of their bullpen. And when you look at throughout the season, he was consistently one of their more trusted relievers. And the best thing about him, that maybe is a little bit of a contrast from Cionel Pérez, is that Coulombe was great at getting both sides of the plate out. He's not just a lefty guy. Brandon Hyde would usually bring him in for those lefty pockets, but we saw it multiple times against Tampa Bay, where he had success against Randy Arozarena and Harold Ramirez. And so that's probably his most valuable attribute. Is, you mentioned the unique pitch mix that he has. but his ability to get both sides of the plate out.
Yeah, he was better against righties this year, which is kind of remarkable for a left-handed reliever. Righties only hit 212, lefties hit 256. I mean, he's still good against left-handers, right? And you love to bring him in for a lefty pocket. But, I mean, that's so huge for a team, especially with the 3-batter minimum, that you have a guy that can come in and is a lefty and can get righties out. And you mentioned the pitch mix. I did want to go there. Rarely in 2023 in baseball do you have a reliever who throws 6 different pitches. And yet that is where we are with Danny Coulombe. The cutter was kind of the number 1 pitch. I mean, that was 43% of the time. Nothing else was above, I think, 19% this year. So like he was throwing a lot of cutters, but then he had this sinker that nobody was hitting, and he had this new slider, he had the sweeper, and the cutter was pretty new. I mean, it was a brand new pitch for him, and he kind of threw it all the time. It was a change from his old slider. He came in, it felt like hip surgery, new team, kind of new man, and maybe it was just kind of a reset for him. And all of a sudden, he was like, yeah, I got these new offerings. Yeah, I don't care that I throw 6 pitches. Yeah, I can get righties out. Right. And I wonder if he even expected him to be like this dominant at times that he was with the Orioles this year.
He's a very humble guy, but at the same time, he knew that it was somewhere in there, right? He always believed that a season like this was somewhere in there. It was just everything kind of lining up to get to this point. And he's a guy that, you know, when you look at it, all of these teams are focused on pitch mix and adding sweepers and these other things. And it doesn't work for every pitcher, frankly, that approach. But for him, it has really given him, gave him the success that he had this past season. It's funny because I think when you look at his pitch mix now on Baseball Savant, it says cutter. At the beginning of the season, for the first half of the season, it said slider for that pitch. So Savant sometimes changes like the designations. And so I think he views it as a cutter. But if you look at it, sometimes it can move more like a slider. And then he does have the sweeper and the curveball. And that's the most interesting part of his pitch mix. And frankly, that's why he is so successful against right-handed batters too, because he's got the cutter or the hard slider that can go down and into a righty. And then he's got the sweeper that he's not really throwing that as much to a righty. It's mostly a pitch that you use against same-handed batters as you. And then he's got the curveball that's not exactly 12-6, but that he really throws into the ground a lot and gets swings and misses with. And so when you look at his pitch mix, it's like something like 70 or 75% of his pitches are essentially breaking balls. If you're going to count the cutter as a slider, which it does move a little bit more like a slider. At least he throws it like a slider because he's not trying to backdoor guys. He's not trying to backdoor righties on it. And so when you look at that, it's really interesting to see a relief pitcher have 6 pitches and then for 70% of his pitches to be breaking balls. Honestly, some of the most fun I had throughout the season, I mentioned him facing Randy Arozarena, but was his at-bats against him, because the first time I think it was in May, and then there was another one in that big series in July maybe, and he threw him nothing but breaking balls. And I think one time he struck him out in a big moment in May. It's been so long, I can't remember exactly the situation, but he came in with runners on base, I think, and it was a 1-run game in May. And Arozarena, who I don't need to remind anybody, is kills Orioles pitching, and he just throws all breaking balls just repeatedly. And there was at one point during the season he had faced Arozarena like 3 times, and had thrown like 15 pitches, and 14 of them were breaking balls. And so those at bats were really fun because you've got this great hitter who's had a bunch of success against the Orioles, and you've got this new lefty who kind of came out of nowhere, and he's just repeatedly throwing breaking balls and having success, because you would think in your head that's not a matchup that would suit the Orioles. You've got a left-handed reliever with a right-handed batter who has a lot of success against lefties. So those at-bats really stand out to me, just the way that he can he has that unique pitch mix.
Yeah, and he mixed it throughout the year, and he was more of a 4-seam guy before when he would throw fastballs. Not that he throws very hard. I mean, he's 91 basically, but became more of a sinker guy this year. All of a sudden, opponents hit 071 against his sinker, and he doesn't throw his 4-seamer as much. And it's fun to watch him because he kind of like he's like an old school junk baller, except for the fact that he's a 2023 reliever and nobody's hitting him hard. Like that was the other thing all year, is that, most of the year he was like top 5 in lowest hard hit rate and lowest average exit velocity. And he ended up like top 15, top 20 in most of those categories. He doesn't really look like anyone else. And he almost felt like he should have been picked up by the Orioles like 3 years ago, like deep into the rebuild, like a guy that nobody sees the value in. And it's like, Billy, this is Danny Coulombe. His only flaw is that he throws 90 miles per hour, but he is the best relief pitcher that's on waivers. Like that was how they found him. And again, like a 2.81 ERA, 51 in the third innings, 28% strikeout rate, doesn't walk anybody, 6% walk rate. I mean, he was just fantastic. And it feels like the Orioles got they didn't go for the, 98 with a wipeout slider. They went for like a different kind of guy, and it worked out.
Yeah, no, you referenced some of the numbers that you can find on Savant, but if you go to his Savant page, there's more red on this page than I believe any player on the Orioles. It is shocking when you think of a player or a pitcher like Danny Coulombe, and you don't think of him being a top tier reliever where it's very red, like dark red, like average exit velocities, 96th percentile, chase percentage, 94 percentile, hard hit percentage, 95th percentile. It's wild. And then you just have the couple of blue ones, which are dark blue, where it's fastball, velo, and extension, right? And it's just funny. And you're right. And I think that goes to an important part of bullpen, of how you can manage a bullpen, or rather how you assemble a bullpen. I wonder, I'm curious how much teams look at this stuff. I'm curious if the Orioles look at it this way, in terms of having different types of pitchers who can work off of one another, and that give you a type of variety in the bullpen. When you look at just how different he is compared with Yennier Cano and Felix Bautista, like, he's basically the inverse of Felix Bautista, right? A short lefty who has no extension and throws 90 miles an hour, and is only throwing breaking balls, essentially, right? And so I find that to be an interesting part. And then just overall his consistency, which was valuable. Like, God, I'd be hard pressed to remember him having back-to-back bad outings. And like, listen, with a reliever, you're always going to have bad outings. Like, I remember the one in Atlanta, he didn't have a great one. Give it the home run to Kevin Pillar, but you're going to have bad outings. But I think the key is preventing that from snowballing. And when we look ahead to Cionel Pérez, like, that was kind of the problem for him in the first half of the season. Was it just felt like he would stack bad outings, and that's something that Coulombe kind of prevented.
Yeah, let's get to Cionel Pérez, because also I think he's a very staunch difference to Cionel Pérez. Like, they are both smaller lefties, and Cionel Pérez is like he's a little guy out there, really, compared to some of the other Orioles relievers. But he's throwing 97 from the left side, and he's hunting ground balls all day. So let's kind of get to his season, because it looked different, right? Like, Danny Coulombe had a 0.84 ERA in April. They bring him over, trade cash considerations from the Twins the day before opening day. We're like, who is this guy? And all of a sudden, he's maybe their second best reliever in April. So we'll get back to discussing the seasons of Danny Coulombe and Cionel Pérez with Jacob Calvin Meyer of the Baltimore Sun in just a second. But first, this episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast is brought to you by Jase Medical. Now, I know we come to sports to escape some of the crazy things in life, but can we just talk for a minute about preparing for tough situations? Whether you're on extended travel, bracing for a major weather event, or limited by yet another supply shortage, you're covered, thanks to our partners at Jase Medical that have life-saving antibiotics and a long list of daily medications that can be ordered on a 1-year supply. Jase Medical has the product they call the Jase Case, which is a pack of 5 different antibiotics to treat a long list of bacterial illnesses. So visit jasemedical.com and complete your physician encounter. It'll be reviewed by a board-certified physician, and your medications will be dispensed by a licensed pharmacy at a fraction of the regular cost. It's never been more important to be prepared than today. So go to jasemedical.com and use offer code LOCKEDON to get $20 off your order. Flip side is Cionel Pérez. He's coming off a 1.40 ERA in 2022. Burst onto the scene, was basically just like a huge 7th and 8th inning guy for the Orioles, really even early in the season, before they got to Bautista and then Lopez, it was Cionel Pérez. I had talked a lot last offseason. People would ask, who's a guy due to get worse, have regression? I was like, it's Cionel Pérez. You would look at his expected stats, the expected ERA. It was like 2.5 runs larger than his actual one. I think it was the biggest difference in all of baseball in 2022. And in the first half, it looked like, oh no, like the regression came for him big time. And then he just turned it around in the second half. So when you look back to really, it was a tale of 2 seasons. Like, what do you take away from 2023 Cionel Pérez?
Yeah, it's really tough, because if you look at it holistically, you can't really say that it was a good season. I know, the overall 3.54 ERA is one that, you look at that and you're like, okay, we can, you can live with that. But if you dig into it a little bit more, it was a struggle because of how bad the first half was. And there were moments there in late spring, early summer where, Brandon Hyde was really reluctant to use Cionel Pérez. Like it didn't get to the point of how it got with Fuji at times, or a couple other guys, but it was rough there for a little bit. And I don't have to remind anybody that fans were clamoring for him to be optioned, or he had no more options. So for him to be off the roster because of just how poorly he was pitching, and I think it's a credit to the organization and to the Orioles that they did stick with him kind of through that rough patch, because he did throw a lot of valuable innings for them over the back half of the season. He was important. He had a few, I believe he had a couple saves in big situations. There was one in Philly maybe. And so, yeah, his season's weird and it's hard to evaluate. You're completely right. When you go into the season, there was kind of one of two directions for Cionel Pérez to go. It was like, okay, either this guy is a potential all-star, because if he does what he did in 2022 again in the first half, he might be one of the best left-handed relievers in the American League, or regression is going to come hard. And it frankly came harder than I feel like anybody could have imagined. It felt rough. And if you remember too, there was some bad luck in there. There were a significant amount of infield hits or soft ground balls. He only gave up 2 home runs all season. And so that's back-to-back seasons. He only gave up 2 home runs. And so that's an extremely valuable part of his, his ability is to keep the ball in the ballpark. And so, because relievers can just get killed if they're giving up too many home runs, like, Austin Voth, if you remember at the beginning of the season. So he's somebody that's hard to evaluate. And I think we'll learn a lot about him and his role on this team, perhaps in the first couple months of next season. Because if he has another first half like he had this past year, then I wouldn't be surprised if the team then goes, okay, now we have to kind of make a move here.
Yeah. And for him, even the whole year, he was keeping the ball on the ground. Like there were some hard hit ground balls, right? And there were some also bad luck, but he finished the year with a 61% ground ball rate. Among pitchers who threw at least 50 innings, Cionel threw 53 1/3 this year in 65 appearances. You mentioned that 3.54 ERA. He was 7th in baseball with a 61% ground ball rate. And then he upped it and he got even better. It's really the tale of two halves. First half of the season, 4.45 ERA, 53% ground ball rate. Second half of the season, after the All-Star break, 2.35 ERA, 73% ground ball rate. That is higher than Yinyer Cano's ground ball rate was in that time for Cionel Pérez. That is what made him so good. And like I mentioned how Coulombe started so fast, Pérez had a 5+ ERA in April. And we're looking around like, as you said, I talked about all offseason, like I prepared myself and the listeners for he's not going to be as good. And I was still shocked at the end of April, like, it didn't have to go this poorly. Like you still have good stuff. It didn't have to go this badly. And then he had that stretch in late July, right after the All-Star break. It was July 29th to September 19th, 23 straight appearances without an earned run. And not all of them were a full inning, right? It was only 17 2/3 innings in 23 appearances. So sometimes he was coming in and getting out of jams. But you have that whole stretch. I think the biggest moment of his season was, you mentioned those saves he had. The other one was in Houston when the Orioles had that weird 9th inning. They were making the changes. They didn't have Felix Bautista. They were putting Heston Kjerstad out in right field, and then right back to the bench, and everybody was moving around. And Pérez just comes in and strikes out Yordan Alvarez on 3 pitches with the tying run at third base. And that was like, hey, you know what? He figured it out. And for me, Jacob, like, this shows something about Cionel Pérez. Like, you could easily get incredibly frustrated with all the success he had in 2022 to feel like my stuff's still not, my fastball's still 97. It's still sinking. I'm still throwing sliders, and nobody was swinging and missing. Like, that was his issue early. He wasn't missing any bats, and the stuff was fairly similar. So you'd have to think he could have gotten frustrated and it could have really spiraled. Instead, he just locked in. And without Felix, there was a time in early September where I felt like, I think I'd go to Cionel Pérez as the 9th inning guy right now. Like, it was a huge turnaround. And I think that's credit to him as well for like sticking with it. Yeah.
Like, I don't know what, the organization's plans are, for 2024 for that closer job. And ideally you would want to have a dedicated guy back there. But if that's not the case, or something happens and you're in a situation again where, perhaps in the 9th inning, there's a lefty pocket. Like, it's not out of the realm of possibility for Cionel Pérez to have some opportunities there to pick up some saves if that's the way that they decide to go. I think a lot of fans would prefer that they don't go that way, and that Pérez is more of a guy that you can bring in for a lefty pocket in the 6th or 7th inning, and then you've got Cano and Coulombe, and then somebody else for the back end. But you mentioned the swing and misses, and the slider was pretty similar to 2022, but I know early in the season he just didn't feel like that pitch had the same bite as it had the year before. And so I'm curious if, and maybe we'll see this early on in 2024, if those numbers start, especially the whiff, numbers and the chase rate, if those numbers start to normalize a little bit and kind of regress back to the mean, and in the other direction, not everything's regression. At the end of the day, like, you have to execute pitches, but you can't ignore, especially for relievers, that is a significant part of this. And the reason, of course, is because of the small sample sizes of everything. And so, when the sample size is so small, you're more likely to have a large, a pretty significant amount of regression or in the opposite direction. So it's like, for him, if we'll see maybe next season with his ability to get swings and misses, because if he can add that, it's not like he was a huge swing and miss guy in 2022, but it was a lot more so than this past season. And if he can get back to that, we're not going to see another season where he has a whatever 1 point something ERA. I don't know if that's in the cards, but I think we could probably see a more consistent season for him if he can just get a little bit of that swing and miss back in his game.
Yeah, and he's still a guy who's, unlike Coulombe, he's still going to be much better against lefties. I mean, this year, lefties hit 213, righties hit 305. Like, he's clearly better against left-handers. But when you kind of dig deeper, you look at his sinker this year, for example, like, opponents hit 291 against it, but they slugged 316. So all the hits are like grounders through the right side. Like, that's all he's given up. They're not elevating. I think the average launch angle on his sinker was negative 14 degrees. Like, they're just beating the ball into the ground. His barrel super low. It was one of the 10 lowest in all of baseball. So, like, a lot of the hits, you can't call them all luck, because when it keeps happening, there's something going on. But that's just kind of who he is. He's not going to give up extra base hits, and he's going to keep you in innings. And he can also, that's what he just needs, as you mentioned. He just needs a couple more strikeouts to get back to, because again, you are playing with fire if you're pitching to contact as a high leverage reliever. You just are. You need more strikeouts. So that kind of brings me to these two guys heading into 2024. Danny Coulombe, interesting, because he is a free agent after 2024. So you never know, if the Orioles either aren't liking what they're seeing or do something weird at the deadline, maybe where they would trade him to get another major league piece. Like, you never know what they're going to do with guys who are expiring free agents. Like, we will see. Like, we don't know what John Angelos and Michael Eyes are thinking. We will see. Cionel Pérez, out of options, but he's got a few more years of control there. So we go into 2024. I think we're both in agreement. Like, they're going to be on the opening day roster, both these guys, unless something really bad happens or an injury happens or whatever. But do you see, we talked about it a little bit. We don't know what the Orioles will look like late in games. Like, do you think both these guys will be high leverage guys throughout 2024?
Well, I think you'd have to say that one of them will be, right? Because you're going to want one of your high leverage guys to be left-handed, and ideally. And so you would hope it would be one of them. And the answer could be both, depending on how they're pitching. I think having both of them in the bullpen, so long as they're both healthy, is valuable, because we've seen Cionel be a little bit streaky at times last season, and so if Cionel's on a heater, like, heck, go to him late in games. We've seen Coulombe come in for 2 innings, which was surprising. I think there was one time maybe against the Dodgers, he pitched like 3 innings or something, and so two and change maybe. And so he's somebody that has more comfortability coming in earlier in games if needed in the 5th or 6th inning, and so. I think you can use both of those guys in different roles, and that's kind of what brings their value. I think for something to watch with Coulombe is, obviously, you just can never know with somebody's health and the way it's going to be. But, he has, relatively consistently throughout his career dealt with some injuries here and there. And so, he was almost completely healthy last season. I think he had one brief stint on the IL, and Cionel had a brief one as well. And so I think for Coulombe, he's going to be in his age 34 season. I think not to get back on the regression bug, but like Coulombe had a pretty high strikeout rate this past season, which, compared with his career was significantly higher. And so I think for him, getting off to a good start would be important, and it would be for Cionel as well. But I think that the answer to that is, if they don't go out and acquire a left-handed reliever, and it's those two guys in the bullpen, maybe they'll have a Cole Irvin as a long man in the bullpen who's left-handed. But in terms of short relievers, if it's those two guys, you're going to want one of them to be to be trusted to pitch in high leverage situations late in games.
And a DL Hall, if he's in the bullpen, is certainly going to be potentially pushing for that. Well, you could play it off as, I think DL Hall might win a starting role, which is not out of the question out of spring training, especially if the O's don't do anything here. But that was kind of bringing me to kind of the last question here for each of us to make a prediction. So I'm not going to put Bruce Zimmerman or Tucker Davidson in this conversation. I'm going to stick to the other 5 lefties who could be in the Orioles bullpen next year. So we're looking at Danny Coulombe, we're looking at Cionel Pérez, we're looking at Cole Irvin, we're looking at DL Hall, and then I'll throw Nick Vespi in there. Go 1 through 5, with 1 being biggest impact and 5 being the least. 1 through 5 of how big an impact those 5 pitchers have on the Orioles bullpen in 2024.
That's great, because I feel like, let me list the names again: Irvin, Coulombe, Perez, Hall, and Vespi.
Yeah,
is that it? All right, so I'll put Vespi 5. He's pitched well when he's been up there, but for whatever reason, he has not gotten a chance to consistently be up. And if DL Hall is going to be in the bullpen, which who knows at this point, but I feel like that's probably more likely than him being in the rotation or being in AAA again. And so if that's going to be the case, I'd say Vespi would be 5. I feel like if we're going to assume Hall is in the bullpen at the start of the season and they're saying, hey, you're a reliever, go. If that's the case, I will put DL Hall 1. I think his upside is higher than anybody else in that bullpen, any of the other lefties in that bullpen. And I think you'd have to – and he's had a ton of success the past 2 seasons in the brief opportunity he's gotten. So I'll put him 1. I'll put Coulombe 2. I guess I feel like I kind of want to put Irvin 3, simply because when you're throwing – if you're going to be in long relief, and I wouldn't be surprised if he gets a spot start here and there. The Orioles have gotten very fortunate the past couple of seasons with their health of their starting pitchers. And so, if that goes in the wrong direction next season, you have a couple injuries. Cole Irvin is a guy that you can rely on to eat some innings. And if Cole Irvin can get back to maybe the guy he was in Oakland, that's going to be a league average starter for you. And that's, just in terms of a wins above replacement standpoint, that's pretty valuable. So, I also think that trade, not we don't have to get into that, but they've still got a couple of years of Cole Irvin, and if he's a solid long reliever that can give you spot starts and can give you some depth in the starting rotation if needed, if somebody gets hurt, that's a pretty valuable thing to have. And so I'll put him 3, and then I'll put Perez 4.
You stole my rankings. This makes for great podcasting. No disagreement right there. I'm going to say Hall 1 because he could be a starter still, but I totally believe in just when he goes to the bullpen, he gets a full healthy season, spring training. Like, it's going to be, in my opinion, like the Orioles don't have to go get Josh Hader because they might have him at home. Second would be Coulombe, just because he can get righties and lefties out and he can give you multiple innings. And, Brandon Hyde, you can argue how he used his bullpen in the playoffs, but as soon as things got iffy, he went to Danny Coulombe immediately. Like, Danny Coulombe pitched in the 2nd inning of Game 2 of the ALDS. Like, he went to him because he knew he will put out this fire. 3, I'm going to say Irvin because of that same thing. Like, I think if he has a more, maybe not consistent role, because again, he'll be in long relief. He might be in short relief. He might be spot starts, but I think he has a more consistent roster spot next year because he is out of options. He had options last year, doesn't have them this year, which probably means he's going to have a longer leash of being on the roster. They're not going to DFA an innings eating starter with 3 years of control left unless they absolutely have to, because a rebuilding team will snatch him up in a second. And so, they're not going to get Cole Irvin through waivers. So I think between the long relief and the spot starts, and he actually looked pretty good in short relief at times last year. Like, I think if he is on the team a little more consistently, he does that. Nothing against Cionel Pérez, but the lack of missing bats worries me. And when you can get beaten as bad as he did with, if we're being honest, like singles, like he was beaten with singles and some walks And that is a little concerning. Like when you're not giving up homers, you're not giving up extra base hits, and you still have a 5 ERA in the first month of the season, like that means you're really not missing bats. And so that's a little concerning. And then with Vespi, like I like Nick Vespi. They just clearly don't see that he can potentially take the next level. And honestly, like I think out of the other three, like the Vespi, Tucker Davidson, Bruce Zimmerman, like I think Tucker Davidson might have a bigger impact. I just think there's something there, stealing a player from the Royals and making him good. They can do it in back-to-back off seasons. So that's how
never happened.
Yeah. That's how I see that one playing out. But Jacob, thank you so much for joining us. Listen, I don't think we really knew that Danny Coulombe would play this big of a role in the 2023 Orioles, but here we are, and he could be a huge factor. And obviously Perez figuring things out was great at the end of the season. I know you are headed to Nashville for the winter meetings, but kind of let everybody know where they can follow you and follow your work over at the Baltimore Sun.
Yeah, BaltimoreSun.com to follow our coverage, and then on Twitter at @JCalvinMeyer. So appreciate you having me on, and everybody for listening.
Yeah, it was Jacob Calvin-Meyer, the Baltimore Sun, joining us. Thank you so much for tuning in. We'll be back later this week with more Orioles talk. But until then, I'm Connor Newcomb, and this has been the Locked On Orioles podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.